The proteins that hold your body's architecture together, collagen in the skin, crystallins in the lens of the eye, the basement membrane of every kidney tubule, are being permanently modified after every meal. The modification is chemical, it is irreversible, and it is calibrated to a single variable, the height of the glucose peak in the bloodstream, in the 20 minutes after eating. That reaction has a name. The chemistry that browns bread in a hot oven is identical chemistry running inside your bloodstream at body temperature, slowly, continuously, accelerating in proportion to the glucose concentration present. A grain of sugar dissolves on the tongue. The glucose molecule crosses the intestinal wall, enters the portal vein, arrives in general circulation. Blood sugar begins to climb. By minute 30, it approaches the peak. By minute 45, it crests. By minute 90, it returns toward baseline. That curve, the postprandial glucose curve, is drawn 3 times a day, every day, for the duration of a life. And the height of that peak, more than any other variable under daily control, determines how rapidly the body caramelizes from the inside. The person who just finished dinner is inside that window right now. The chemistry started with the first bite. The Maillard reaction is calibrating to the peak, and the clock is counting. The chemistry is running. Think of it as an oven thermostat. The Maillard reaction that browns bread runs faster at higher temperatures. That reaction running in your bloodstream runs faster at higher glucose concentrations. A blood sugar that stays at baseline is a cool oven. The reaction proceeds, but slowly. A blood sugar spiking to twice the baseline is a hot oven. The reaction accelerates. The thermostat is the glucose peak. Every meal sets it. Louis Camille Maillard documented the reaction in 1912. Glucose reacting with amino groups on proteins. Food science for most of a century. The reaction explaining why bread crusts brown, why meat develops flavor at high temperature, why caramel forms from heated sugar. Then the question that changed the field entirely. What about at 37 degrees? Slowly, over years, inside the bloodstream. The chemistry was identified in living tissue as the mechanism connecting glucose to aging, as Sarami and colleagues reported at Rockefeller University in Scientific American. The reaction that browns bread in minutes at 200 degrees runs inside the body at 37 degrees across decades, producing identical end products through identical chemistry at a rate governed by glucose concentration and time. The aldehyde group on glucose attacks a lysine or arginine residue on a protein. Forms a shift base, temporary and reversible if glucose drops quickly. If glucose stays elevated, the shift base rearranges to an Amadori product, more stable and harder to undo. Given weeks, the Amadori product undergoes further oxidation and dehydration, forming advanced glycation end products. AGEs cross-link proteins permanently. No enzyme in the body reverses them. Where they accumulate tells the story of what breaks first. Collagen. Skin loses elasticity as the scaffolding caramelizes, the crosslinks welding adjacent collagen strands together so the tissue can no longer stretch and recoil the way it did at 30. The wrinkle is a surface marker of a molecular event happening throughout the body, in every collagen-containing structure from the Achilles tendon to the arterial wall. Crystallins of the eye lens, cataracts developing across 60 years of Maillard chemistry on proteins that are never replaced, the lens gradually losing transparency as the cross-linked crystallins scatter incoming light. Basement membrane of the kidney, the scarring that becomes nephropathy, the filtration surface thickening molecule by molecule until the kidney's ability to clear waste products declines, and the physician begins discussing function percentages. The walls of every artery stiffening that elevates systolic blood pressure decade by decade because the elastic recoil that absorbed each heartbeat's pressure pulse has been replaced by rigid crosslinks that transmit the force directly to downstream vessels. HbA1c, the test your physician orders, measures this chemistry directly. Red blood cells live 120 days. The percentage of glycated hemoglobin records the average glucose exposure across that lifespan. An ongoing Maillard reaction running on hemoglobin molecules in real time. Unlike a fasting glucose test, HbA1c cannot be altered by skipping breakfast before the appointment. It integrates every spike, every plateau, every postprandial peak across 4 months of eating. The number on the lab report is the Maillard reaction's own report card. Reaction rate depends on collision probability between glucose molecules and protein amino groups, and collision probability rises faster than linearly as concentration increases. A blood sugar spiking to 200 for 30 minutes produces more glycation damage than a blood sugar sitting steadily at 120 for an equivalent period, even when average glucose exposure is similar. The shape of the curve matters more than the area under it. The peaks are doing more damage per minute than the plateaus because the reaction rate at a glucose concentration of 200 is substantially higher than twice the rate at 100. The chemistry penalizes spikes. Continuous glucose monitor data made the peaks visible for the first time. Non-diabetics wearing monitors discovered their cereal sent glucose above 190. An afternoon banana on an empty stomach produced a 40-minute spike. White rice at lunch pushed the curve higher than a chocolate bar in a single subject because the glycemic response depends on the food's structure, the meal's composition, the individual's microbiome, and the timing relative to the last meal. The diagnostic categories, normal versus pre-diabetic, calibrated on single fasting measurements, were missing enormous metabolic events happening between doctor visits. A fasting glucose of 92 comfortably within the normal range said nothing about the spike to 185 that happened 90 minutes after lunch and returned to baseline before the next morning's blood draw. What happens between meals was exactly the chemistry the fasting test could never see. But if the peak drives the damage, does the damage end when the peak returns to baseline? Anyone who has been told their blood sugar is normal may be spiking into the pre-diabetic range after every meal. The spikes are invisible to the fasting test, invisible to the HbA1c until they have been running long enough to shift the average, and invisible to the physician unless a continuous monitor is worn. But the Maillard reaction sees them. Every spike is a thermostat adjustment, an oven temperature increase, a reaction rate acceleration that produces more amidori intermediates per minute than the baseline concentration produces per hour. Now the amidori products formed during a glucose spike do not become permanent AGEs within that window. The conversion from reversible shift-based to semi-stable amidori to permanent cross-link spans approximately 72 hours of further oxidation, dehydration, and molecular rearrangement, as the Maillard kinetics banes established in chemical research in toxicology describe. The exact timeline varies with protein turnover rates and local biochemistry. The direction is unambiguous. The 72-hour shadow, a single high glycemic dinner on Monday, is still producing irreversible protein crosslinks on Wednesday morning. The amidori intermediates formed during Monday's glucose peak spend Tuesday undergoing further chemical modification, oxidation, and dehydration reactions proceeding at body temperature, and by Wednesday the final crosslinks are locking into place on proteins the body has no mechanism to repair. The collagen molecule that was cross-linked on Wednesday morning will carry that crosslink for the remainder of its functional life, which in some tissues exceeds a decade. 7 daily high glycemic dinners is 7 overlapping cascades, each at a different stage of the shift to amidori to AG conversion sequence, each producing intermediates that feed the next stage while the previous cascade is still converting. Monday's dinner is at the final AG stage, Tuesday's is at the amidori stage, Wednesday's is still at the shift-based stage. All 3 cascades are running simultaneously in one bloodstream, on the same collagen, in the same arterial walls. The person eating 3 high glycemic meals daily has approximately 9 overlapping cascades running at any given moment, the exact count depending on individual glucose peaks and protein turnover rates. The person who thinks each meal's damage is contained within hours is underestimating the temporal reach of the chemistry by a factor of days. Practically, the shadow is that a single weekend of dietary indiscretion is not contained within the weekend. Friday evening spike is still converting to permanent crosslinks on Monday morning. Saturday's brunch continues through Tuesday. The chemistry recognizes glucose concentration and time, and the intermediates it produces respect no schedule but their own. If the damage propagates for days, what determines the height of the peak that starts it? Chemistry is clear. The glucose peak is the rate-determining variable. The peaks have been running unopposed 3 times a day for as many decades as you have been eating. The AGs have accumulated in proteins you built as a child and have never replaced, crosslinks locking collagen strands together in bonds no enzyme can reach. Maillard chemistry operates continuously, calibrated to the height of the curve you draw after every meal. The 54,000 curves drawn across a lifetime are as many thermostat settings, as many Maillard rate determinations, as many decisions made by the chemistry of the postprandial window. What changes the equation? Whether the peak can be intercepted before the Maillard reaction registers its maximum rate. Whether a lever exists, available in the postprandial window when glucose is highest, that lowers the peak before the Maillard reaction reaches its maximum rate. A lever exists. It requires no prescription, no device, no appointment. It operates through a pathway most physicians never mention because it has no pharmaceutical equivalent. Endothelium, the single-cell layer lining every vessel, produces nitric oxide through the eNOS pathway established in prior discussions. When glucose spikes, the chemistry inside each endothelial cell shifts. Glucose enters the cell and is metabolized through the mitochondrial electron transport chain. At normal glucose concentrations, the electrons flow through the chain in an orderly sequence, producing ATP with minimal leakage. At elevated glucose concentrations, the electron transport chain receives more substrate than it can process at its normal rate. Electrons leak from the chain and react with molecular oxygen, producing superoxide, the reactive oxygen species that begins the cascade. The ROAS neutralizes nitric oxide before it can reach the smooth muscle that relaxes the vessel wall. Worse, the ROAS damages the eNOS enzyme itself, uncoupling it, converting it from a nitric oxide producer to a superoxide producer. The factory that was protecting the artery reverses into the factory that damages it. The reversal is proportional to the glucose peak, higher peak, more substrate overload, more electron leakage, more superoxide, more eNOS uncoupling, more damage. Flow-mediated dilation data quantifies the insult. A single high glycemic meal impaired flow-mediated dilation by more than half in healthy young subjects, the reduction persisting for up to 6 hours afterward. One breakfast, measurable vascular damage lasting most of the workday. The endothelial insult is quantifiable, repeatable, and proportional to the peak height. The meal that spiked glucose to 190 produced more endothelial damage than the meal that peaked at 140, measured in a single subject on different days eating different foods. RAGE receptors on cell surfaces detect AGEs directly. When AGEs bind RAGE, the cell activates NF-kappa B, the master inflammatory switch, which produces cytokines, generates reactive oxygen species, and upregulates the expression of more RAGE receptors on the cell surface. The positive feedback loop is the key mechanism. More AGEs produce more RAGE, which produces more inflammation, which produces more ROS, which damages more eNOS, which produces more superoxide instead of more nitric oxide. Chronic RAGE activation from daily postprandial spikes equals chronic low-grade inflammation running beneath the diagnostic threshold for years. The thread connecting cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and kidney failure runs back through chronic inflammation, back through RAGE, back through AGEs, back through the height of the curve. What intercepts the curve? Muscle contraction. The insulin-independent glucose channel the walking discussion described, GLUT4, translocates to the cell surface when a muscle contracts because the muscle needs fuel and activates its own supply line through AMPK, AMP-activated protein kinase. When the muscle contracts, its ATP stores drop and AMP accumulates. The rising AMP-to-ATP ratio activates AMPK, which triggers the machinery that moves GLUT4 vesicles from their storage position deep inside the cell to the cell. The vesicles fuse with the membrane. Glucose channels open. The muscle pulls glucose directly from the bloodstream because it needs fuel to keep contracting, regardless of whether insulin is present or effective. The pathway bypasses the insulin receptor entirely. A muscle that is contracting clears glucose from the blood through a door that insulin resistance cannot lock. The person whose physician has discussed insulin resistance, whose fasting glucose has been climbing by a point or two each year, whose HbA1c sits at 5.8 and rising, has a clearance pathway available that operates independently of the hormone the body is becoming less responsive to. This is why timing matters more than duration. Walking during the postprandial window, when glucose is flooding in from the gut, means muscle contraction is pulling glucose out at the moment the gut is putting it in. The two flows partially cancel. The peak never reaches the height it would have reached with quiet muscles. Walking an hour before the meal accomplishes nothing for the postprandial peak because the glucose has not yet arrived. Walking 2 hours after arrives too late because the spike is already crested and the Maillard reaction has already registered the peak height. 3 15-minute walks after meals controlled 24-hour glucose dramatically better than one 45-minute walk at any other time, as DiPietro and colleagues demonstrated at George Washington University, published in Diabetes Care. Same total walking at matching intensity, with only timing differed. The post-dinner walk was the single most effective intervention in the study. Post-meal walking reduced glucose excursions compared to walking at other times of day, as Reynolds and colleagues confirmed at the University of Otago using continuous glucose monitors in adults with type 2 diabetes. That data, the convergence of GLUT4 physiology and post-meal timing trials, is why I timed the evening walk to the last bite rather than the alarm clock. The glucose curve responded to the timing before anything else changed. Well, the dose response curve is steepest at the bottom. Going from 0 to 10 minutes of post-meal movement produces a larger benefit per minute than going from 40 to 50. Even 2 to 3 minutes of post-meal movement produced measurable glucose reductions in the De Vivier study from the Netherlands. The first 5 minutes are doing the heaviest biochemical work because the GLUT4 translocation occurs rapidly once contraction begins, and the glucose flooding into the blood from digestion meets newly opened channels on muscle cells that were closed seconds earlier. The person who cannot walk for 15 minutes can walk for 3 and still intercept the steepest portion of the curve. The person who stands and washes the dishes after dinner is activating the soleus, the quadriceps, and the gluteal muscles at an intensity sufficient to trigger AMPK activation and GLUT4 translocation. The muscle distinguishes between contracting and sitting still, and any contraction at any intensity during the postprandial window opens the GLUT4 door. Reynolds' study at the University of Otago added a dimension the timing data alone could not. The post-meal walks produced their largest glucose reduction after the evening meal, not the morning meal. The circadian multiplier was visible in the data. An identical walk, a single subject, matching intensity produced a larger absolute glucose reduction in the evening because the evening peak was higher. The intervention was most effective when the problem was most severe. The peak is only half the story. Return to the oven thermostat. An identical meal cooked at matching temperature produces different browning depending on how long the oven stays hot. A meal eaten at noon and a meal eaten at 7 p.m. are identical food entering different metabolic environments, and the browning that results is different because the oven's thermostat is set differently at different times of day. Well, the liver's circadian enzymatic decline described in the meal timing discussion means hepatic glucose processing peaks in the morning and declines through the evening. Insulin sensitivity follows that curve, highest at breakfast, lowest at dinner. The beta cells of the pancreas produce less insulin per unit of glucose stimulus in the evening than in the morning, and the insulin they do produce is less effective at driving glucose into cells because the insulin receptors on muscle and liver tissue have reduced their responsiveness as the day progressed. An equivalent glucose load requiring 50 units of insulin at noon might require 70 at 7 p.m. And even at 70, the clearance is slower because the downstream signaling from receptor to GLUT4 translocation has lost amplitude. Circadian multiplier on the postprandial window. The postprandial window after a 7 p.m. dinner produces a higher glucose peak than the same window after a noon lunch. The food did not change. The liver receiving it is running at reduced capacity. The insulin clearing the glucose is operating at reduced sensitivity. The muscles, if sedentary on the couch, are disposing nothing. The peak runs higher and longer than the identical meal at noon would produce. The person who ate identical portions at noon and 7 p.m. and wore a continuous glucose monitor for both meals would see the evening curve climbing higher, peaking later, and returning to baseline more slowly. The area under the curve visibly larger on the monitor's display for no reason. The food itself can explain. Post-dinner walking is the most consequential intervention for a reason the timing alone does not explain. The circadian multiplier makes the evening meal's peak disproportionately higher because 3 clearance systems have simultaneously downshifted. The liver is processing less glucose per minute. The insulin signal is weaker per unit of hormone. The GLUT4 pathway, if the legs are motionless on the couch, contributes nothing. The walk intercepts the highest peak of the day at the moment when every other clearance system has downshifted. The walk compensates for the circadian decline of every other pathway simultaneously, doing the work the liver and the insulin would have done if the meal had arrived at noon instead of 7. Moving my largest meal to noon and keeping the evening plate light was the response to that circadian convergence. The glucose curve measured the difference before the scale did. Each window sets the next. And then the dimension that connects the meals to each other, the postprandial windows, are not independent. Each one sets the metabolic conditions for the next. A high-fiber breakfast produces sustained colonic fermentation, the bacteria continuing to produce short-chain fatty acids for hours after the meal. Butyrate and propionate, the primary fermentation products, maintain GLP-1 secretion from intestinal L cells and improve insulin sensitivity into the next meal, as Jenkins and colleagues characterized in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in the study that named the second meal effect. The fermentation does not stop when the meal ends because the fiber arriving in the colon continues to provide substrate for the bacterial populations that produce the short-chain fatty acids. The lunch following a high-fiber breakfast produces a lower glucose peak than a matching lunch following a high glycemic breakfast, even though the lunches are identical. The difference is the metabolic environment the breakfast created, the insulin sensitivity, the GLP-1 tone, the hepatic glucose uptake capacity that the fermentation products maintained across the 4-hour gap between meals. Implications chain forward through the day. A high glycemic breakfast spikes at breakfast and primes a higher spike at lunch by failing to initiate the colonic fermentation that would have improved insulin sensitivity 4 hours later. The higher lunch spike primes a higher dinner spike through that mechanism. Each meal's postprandial window influences the next in a forward cascade. The day's metabolic trajectory is partly set by what happened at the first meal. By the third meal, the cumulative effect of 3 unmanaged windows has produced a glucose environment substantially different from the one produced by 3 managed windows, even if the food was identical across all 3 meals. Reverse cascading is equally real. A high-fiber breakfast, oats or legumes, initiates fermentation that improves the lunch window through sustained GLP-1 and improved insulin sensitivity. A post-lunch walk intercepts the lunch peak through GLT-4 translocation. The lower lunch peak produces less afternoon fatigue, less reactive hypoglycemia, less evening craving, the conditions that make a moderate dinner more likely. Each window managed improves the metabolic conditions for the next window. The day that began with fiber and a walk operates in a fundamentally different metabolic register than the day that began with refined carbohydrate and a chair, even though both bodies ate matching total calories by sunset. Think of the day's 3 meals as dominoes. The first domino's angle determines how the second falls, and the second determines the third. A breakfast that spikes sets the dominoes at a steep angle because the high glucose depletes the metabolic buffers, exhausts the first phase insulin response, and fails to initiate the colonic fermentation that would have improved the next window. A breakfast that sustains sets them shallow. The fermentation products maintain GLP-1 and insulin sensitivity across the gap. The moderate glucose peak preserves the first phase insulin response for lunch, and the steady energy eliminates the reactive hypoglycemia that drives the mid-morning craving for fast carbohydrate. The walk after lunch straightens the second domino before it topples the third. Each intervention at each window operates on its own chemistry and on the next window's starting conditions simultaneously. The morning I swapped the cereal for oats changed the trajectory. 3 days later, dinner's glucose curve had flattened, the forward cascade visible from the first meal through the last. The curve measured what the literature described. Now, every window compounds. 54,000 windows across a lifetime, 3 meals a day, 3 postprandial curves over 50 years. Each one either intercepted by muscle contraction or running at full height against quiet musculature. Each one's Maillard intermediates either minimized by a lower peak or maximized by a higher one, then propagating for 72 hours regardless. Each one either feeding the next meal's spike through a high glycemic cascade or attenuating it through fiber-sustained fermentation that improves insulin sensitivity hours later. Integrated across a lifetime of postprandial windows, in total glycemic exposure, in cumulative endothelial damage, in Ag accumulation on proteins that cannot be replaced, in inflammatory signaling through RAGE receptors that upregulate their own expression with every activation, is the molecular difference between a body that maintains its architecture and a body that caramelizes from within. The kidney that filters efficiently at 70 versus the kidney whose basement membrane has thickened enough to reduce clearance. The lens that remains transparent versus the lens whose cross-linked crystallines scatter light into the opacity the ophthalmologist calls a cataract. The artery that dilates under shear stress versus the artery whose NOS has been uncoupled so many times that the enzyme now produces more superoxide than nitric oxide. Each outcome traces back through identical chemistry, through the lifetime of curves, through one question asked at each one: was the peak intercepted, or was the oven left on high? La passeggiata in Italy. El paseo in Spain. The Chinese proverb, walk 100 steps after a meal and live to 99. Every traditional culture arrived at an identical practice through observation across centuries. The physiology arrived at a matching conclusion through continuous glucose monitors, flow-mediated dilation studies, AMPK signaling pathways, and Maillard kinetics. The two paths converge because the chemistry has been the same the whole time. The grandmother who walked after dinner was intercepting the glucose curve through GLUT4 translocation without knowing what GLUT4 was. The culture that made the post-dinner walk a social ritual was engineering the postprandial window into the day's architecture without understanding the molecular mechanism. The practice survived across centuries because the bodies that followed it aged differently from the bodies that did not, and the difference was visible in the joints, the skin, the eyes, and the arteries of the cultures that walked after eating. The walk was the intervention. The chemistry was the reason. The tradition preserved the practice across centuries. The science explains why it worked across every culture that practiced it. Grain dissolves and the glucose crosses the intestinal wall. Blood sugar begins to climb. The clock that started with the first bite is that clock that has been running after every meal for as many years as this body has been eating. The height of the peak is being decided in the next few minutes. The Maillard reaction is calibrating its rate to that height. The Amadori intermediates forming now will still be converting to permanent crosslinks 72 hours from now, each one locking a collagen strand to its neighbor in a bond. No enzyme can break. The endothelium is about to respond with smooth nitric oxide release or with the inflammatory reversal that repeated across that lifetime becomes the diagnosis decades later. Muscles are quiet, or the legs are moving and the GLUT4 channels are pulling glucose into cells that need it for fuel. The walk that starts in the next 5 minutes intercepts the steepest portion of the curve at the hour when the circadian multiplier has made the peak highest, after a day whose metabolic trajectory was set by what happened at breakfast. The chemistry cares about contractions, about whether the muscles that could have pulled glucose from the peak were active or still. The 20 minutes are running.